Welcome everybody to this special edition of the Geo interview. I am Ashish Singh, and today we have with us Professor Rajan Menon, who is the Director of Grant Strategy Program at Defense Priorities, the Anna and Bernard Switzer Chair Emeritus in International Relations at the Powell School City College of New York. And Professor Menon is also a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, Columbia University, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has authored numerous articles and books, including co-authoring Conflict in Ukraine, The Unwinding of the Post-Cold War Order. So it is in these series that we are going to discuss with Professor Menon some questions on Europe and, like on the wider plane, what is next for Europe, what comes next. So Professor Menon, welcome to the Geostrata.
Thank you, Ashish. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here with you and the other members of the Geostrata audience.
Great. So we'll dive right in. So Professor Menon, what's next for Europe from this point in the Russian war on Ukraine? Like what might happen? Because Russia seems to have acquired momentum in the Ukraine. 2 new states are joining NATO, and then there are other flashpoints ranging from sanctions to cyber attacks. So your opinion on this, please.
So the first thing to note is this is the biggest crisis that Russia and the West have been involved in since the end of the Cold War, by far. There were tensions building between the United States and Russia over Ukraine since at least 2014. I would argue even before that, because in 2008, as you remember, NATO made the decision in principle to open its ranks to Georgia, but also Ukraine. There is no country of the post-Soviet republics, that is the republics that were once part of the Soviet Union and are now independent countries, that is more important to Russia than Ukraine. Ukraine is in land area, Russia aside, one of the largest, if not the largest countries in Europe. In population, it's about the 5th or 6th largest. Don't hold me to those numbers, but I'm estimating here. It's a fellow Slavic country. Ukrainians are by and large members of the Orthodox Church, about a 1,600 mile border between them. And so the prospect that Ukraine would enter NATO was of grave concern to Russia. Then we have the 2014 crisis, which I'm sure your audience is familiar with. Nobody quite expected a full-on invasion by Russia of Ukraine, even though US intelligence in the run-up to the invasion warned several times that it would happen. I myself didn't expect it. I think most of us were caught off guard. So we now have a full-blown war. The initial phase of the campaign, as you know, was from the north, where the Russians tried to move through Chernihiv to Kiev with the idea, I think, of replacing the government. There were activities elsewhere as well. That failed miserably. And since then, after about a 3-4 week calibration, the Russians have pivoted east to the Donbass, which is in eastern Ukraine. It is the industrial, coal mining, resource-rich area adjoining Russia, with a substantial either ethnic Russian population or a population of Ukrainians for whom Russian is the first language. They appear to be making significant headway, the Russians, although they've taken also significant losses in both soldiers and armament. So that's kind of where we stand at the moment. One final thing, the latest development, as you, I'm sure, are aware, is the supply of the HIMARS weapon system from the United States to Ukraine. I think about 8 have been delivered so far. And what we can see thus far is that that weapon is taking a pretty significant toll on Russian ammunition dumps. Whether that reduces the Russian artillery attacks on the Donbass remains to be seen. But at the moment, those artillery attacks remain really fast and furious. If Russia is able to consolidate its control over Donbass and also retain its holdings along the Black Sea coast and in the southeast, we're looking possibly at a partition of Ukraine. But the war is far from over.
Okay, and could you, like, again, based on recent developments, Could you please talk about the strategic significance as well as the vulnerability of the Suwalki Gap, of which we have been hearing a lot recently?
Right. So the Suwalki Gap controversy goes back actually to the Cold War. The Suwalki Gap is about 100 kilometers long. It stretches along the Polish-Lithuanian border. It's named for the town of Suwalki in northeastern Poland. So to the west of the Suwalki Gap, you have the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, which, as you know, is cut off from the Russian mainland. To the east, you have Belarus, which is a Russian ally. To the north, you have Lithuania, and to the south, you have Poland. So the worry of strategists is, it was true in the Cold War and now, is that if Russia decided currently to say, well, we need to escalate the war because the United States in particular and NATO in general are in effect co-belligerents because they are heavily involved in supporting and now supplying the Ukrainians. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but this is what strategists think about. If the Russians were to close the Suwalki Gap, the immediate consequence is that the three Baltic states who are members of the alliance would be cut off from the rest of NATO and therefore almost indefensible. Now, the frontline state, of course, would be Lithuania, but it is not in a position to offer much of resistance to the Russian army because it has armed forces of about 20,000 and an air force with about 5 planes, including transport planes. So that's the significance of Suwalki Gap. Do I personally think the Russians are going to attack a NATO state? I don't think so. They have their hands full in Ukraine. I think the attack on a NATO state would trigger Article 5 of the Collective Security Alliance. I don't think President Putin is a risk taker or a gambler and wants at the moment to have an even larger war pitting Russia against Ukraine. And certainly it would not be a good thing for NATO to have a confrontation with Russia. I think it would be sheer madness to expect to hope for any kind of outcome like that on either side.
Thank you. And building on this, what are some lessons that Europe should learn from this war insofar as the European security architecture is concerned?
Right. So, as you know, once the Cold War ended, rather than create a pan-European security architecture that included Russia, on the theory that the Cold War was over, Russia in the 1990s was being hailed as a democracy and a budding market economy, why not fold it into a pan-European security architecture? Right after the Cold War, the last Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, in fact, suggested this. That was not received with receptive responses on the American side. Gorbachev then suggested that once Germany was unified, that is the Federal Republic of Germany and the GDR, which was a Russian ally and a member of the Russian-led Warsaw Pact, came together, that there would be an agreement that NATO would not station any troops in Eastern Germany on the territory of the former GDR. That too didn't work out. Now, flash forward to the 1990s, NATO expansion went from a concept, an idea in the mind of American strategists, to an actual plan. And NATO went from 16 members at the height of the Cold War to 30 now. And if Finland and Sweden join, which is very likely, it'll be 32 members. For Russia, this has been a significant problem. It is now seen as, that is NATO expansion, as something that President Putin is obsessed with. But one has to remember that President Gorbachev was not and is not in favor of it. President Yeltsin in the 1990s repeatedly implored President Clinton not to go forward with it. Many Russians were perplexed because on the one hand, the Cold War was declared to be over. Russia was hailed as a partner, and yet a Cold War alliance was marching toward the Russian border. So NATO expansion is one problem that will remain between Russia and the United States. Now, when it came to Ukraine, at the Bucharest summit, as I mentioned, the decision was taken to, in principle, open the door to Ukraine and Georgia. many people suggested that maybe a way to address Russia's concerns about potential Ukrainian membership in NATO was to make Ukraine a neutral country. So Ukraine would be a non-bloc country, but it would have the freedom to buy weapons from and train its soldiers in any country of its choice. That did not happen for a variety of ways. So one question is NATO expansion, the role of Ukraine in NATO, and the future of Russia's relationship with the West. Now, as far as Europe as a whole, Europe fundamentally remains dependent, as it did, on the American security guarantee. There is a debate about this, and I can just represent to you where I stand on this. My view is that there is no threat facing the Europeans that in any way is comparable to the threat that the Warsaw Pact may have posed to Europe. And I say this even after the war with Russia. Now, why do I say this? If you compare the GDP of Europe with that of Russia, the European Union has a GDP that's about 10 times larger. It's got a GDP of $7 trillion. It's technologically advanced. Many of its members have very advanced defense industries. So there's no reason in principle why Europe couldn't articulate its own sense of strategic defense autonomy over time. So I'm not calling for NATO to be liquidated tomorrow morning. But neither side, neither the Europeans nor the Americans have wanted this. Now, why not? For Europe, it's a great deal to keep defense spending relatively low and to have the United States backstop its security. You might ask, well, what's in this for the United States? Being the prime defender of Europe makes the United States a European power. It also means that a major center of international technology and trade and investment is essentially dependent on the United States for its security. If you add the fact that that is also true of Japan, South Korea, and Australia, it means that partly American primacy in the world derives from the fact that it is the security provider for important centers of global power. So the next question then is, what is the security architecture of Europe? I don't think the option that I and others favor of an autonomous security structure in Europe is going to happen, even though some like President Macron of France have suggested it. In fact, the US presence in NATO is going to increase to about 100,000 troops eventually from the present level of about 300,000. So if anything, the American security guarantee is going to become even stronger. And there is now a move to position American troops on a permanent basis in NATO's eastern flank, which would require a revision, shall we say, of the 1997 Russia NATO Founding Act, in which it was stated that there would be no such permanent stationing. So that's sort of the lay of the land, if you take into account the prospective membership of Sweden and Finland. If anything, NATO is becoming an even bigger force in European security affairs.
And moving from that, what are your views on the 2022 NATO strategic concept?
Yes, well, I would say long on words, short on benchmarks and commitments. So to begin with, NATO has not had a strategic concept, a new strategic concept, since about at least 10 years, give or take. So the fact that it has a new strategic concept is significant, and the obvious backdrop for the strategic concept is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which required NATO to think about, well, what is the alliance supposed to be like now, and what will it do? So it now has shifted NATO from thinking about Russia as a prospective partner to the number one security threat to NATO. This is odd in some ways because, notwithstanding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we can talk about what it has done to Ukraine, that war, it's not clear why it is that Russia's military performance in Ukraine would lead to the conclusion that it is now in a position to threaten all of Europe. Nevertheless, the strategic concept says that that is the case. The strategic concept does not mention in its language something that has been talked about by NATO on the outside recently, and that is the creation of a rapid force for surging troops to the east if need be. So the rapid force is supposed to grow to about 100,000 members, I believe it is. That would be about 7 times its size at the moment. But there's no language in the NATO strategic concept about exactly who will provide how many troops to the rapid force. By the way, I said 100,000. The rapid force is supposed to be 300,000 when it's completely the obligations are fulfilled. That's 7 times what is in train at the moment. So who will provide troops? How will this be funded? Would it be permanently stationed in NATO's eastern flank, or would it surge depending on need? Now, why is this the lack of any commitment? First of all, the strategic concept, my understanding is that when Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, mentioned it, the other members of NATO were kind of taken aback. So that probably explains why it's not in the strategic concept. Now, even though it's not, the question is, will the rapid force reach the level of 300,000? One has to be a little skeptical for the following reasons. First, if you go back to the NATO summit of 2014 in Wales, you'll remember that there were certain benchmarks that European NATO was to fulfill. 2% of national GDP in defense spending, and 20% of the military budget devoted to military procurement. If you ask how many countries have met both criteria, I think the numbers would be 9 and 10 out of 30. So they haven't been even able to do that because these were guidelines and there was no enforcement ability and so on. So coming back to the strategic concept, it has a lot of verbiage about the significance of the Russian threat, the importance of NATO, how good it is for the world, how good it is for Europe, but precious little in terms of concrete commitments that hold countries' feet to the fire. Just a footnote on this. So you'll remember that after the war in Ukraine broke out, there was a commitment by Germany to increase defense spending fairly significantly. And there was a debate about whether this was a one-off thing or it would lead to a multi-year ramping up defense spending in Germany, which would mean maybe close to 2% of GDP. That was the expectation. Given the economic crisis that's enveloped Europe and is going to probably get worse in years to come, there's really the question of whether, in fact, German defense spending will increase over time substantially. At the moment, the defense budget itself has not been increased, but overall spending will increase from the money set aside for under the latest German commitment to increase overall defense spending. But that money will tap out in years to come. And the question is, will the German defense budget proper continue to increase nevertheless?
And this is a conjectural question, but how long do you think will Russia be able to carry this war given its domestic constraints, sanctions, and various things?
Right. So let's talk about sanctions for a second. I think the Western expectation of what the effects of sanctions would be was probably overly optimistic and misplaced in 2 respects. If you look at the history of sanctions, and there have been some good studies, including a very good book by Professor Nicholas Mulder of Cornell on the history of sanctions. And if I had to sort of boil down the gist of the conclusions on sanctions, it is they sometimes tend to work, sometimes don't tend to work. When do they not work? When a country embarks on something that it believes it's vital for its national interest, countries have shown that they are prepared to endure a great deal of pain. Think about the sanctions imposed on India in order to prevent it from getting nuclear weapons. It didn't work. Same thing for Pakistan. Think of the sanctions on Cuba, think of the sanctions on North Korea, think of the sanctions on Iran. So in some sense, when countries embark on a step that they think will invite a counter response, they often price in the fact that sanctions will occur. So in that respect, sanctions at best are a long-term proposition. Secondly, I think there was probably not enough consideration given to how severe the boomerang effect of sanctions could be on the West itself in terms of higher oil and gas prices in particular. But because oil and gas are used in so many things from transportation to manufacturing, what that would have on the inflation prospect. So at the moment, in the United States, the latest inflation figures have been released, the consumer price index, so at 9.1%. That's the highest inflation rate in 40 years. The inflation prospects for Europe look very, very bad. The same thing for Britain. And the question is, will the United States and Europe possibly tip into a recession? A recession in American terms is defined as 2 quarters of negative growth. So that has not been taken into account significantly. And by that, I mean the boomerang effect of the sanctions. So I think the expectation that Russia will wind down this war because of economic pressures overlooks the fact that actually the ruble has strengthened. Russia continues to earn significant amounts of oil and gas revenue. And in fact, we may have to brace for the following. So at the moment, the Russians have stopped shipping gas through the Yamal pipeline that runs through Poland to Europe. They've already stopped that. Since the war began, they've reduced the flow through Nord Stream. That is the Nord Stream 1, the one that actually was built. The second one was canceled, the project, by about 40%. At the moment, and until July 21st, Nord Stream 1 is being shut down for maintenance. There is an increasing fear that Russia will not open up Nord Stream again. That would have a very significant impact on Europe, especially on countries that are highly dependent on Russian energy supplies, Germany, Italy, and so on. It is also possible that President Putin could reduce by a little bit the amount of oil that Russia puts on the world market. And even if you reduced it by about 3 million barrels a day, that could push up oil prices, and the double whammy of increased gas prices and oil prices would have a very, very significant effect. And why would he do that? I think he would like to say, well, you have your weapons, like you've frozen $300 billion of our assets. You've put all kinds of other economic pressure on us. We have our tools as well. And his hope would be that the Western will to continue support to Ukraine will gradually begin to falter. That would be his bet. I'm not saying that that will happen, but that might be his calculation.
And this would be the second last question, and it might be a bit academic. So, how do you see this war and its consequences in terms of, the maneuvering that Russia, China, and the West are doing in terms of, revamping the international economic order or the international security order, for that matter, or even India? The Reserve Bank of India recently notified that we can have trade in rupees, for example. Then various alternates to just to sort of evade the sanctions whenever they do something. So how do you see all of this revamping through a realist lens or a liberal lens? Any theory you might choose.
Right. So one possible consequence we have to brace for is that although the dollar will continue to be the most important currency for denominating value of products, oil, for example, for storing value in foreign exchange, and for settling accounts in international trade, it's going to be the most important. But its importance has declined gradually over time in the last few decades. Countries having witnessed the freezing of about $300 billion in Russian assets are going to ask themselves, well, the dollar is very good, it's very reliable. The United States is an economy that people have a lot of faith in, but should we store so much of our foreign exchange in dollars, or ought we to diversify to other currencies? So that could be one consequence. The second consequence is working out mechanisms for settling accounts in other ways. Now, you mentioned, for example, or you alluded to the discussions in the BRICS countries about using their own currencies for settling accounts. We're a long way from seeing how that plays out, but that is certainly a possibility. So one question is, what conclusions will countries draw about their own vulnerability to sanctions? You'll notice that countries like India and Brazil and Mexico have not jumped to the front and also imposed sanctions on Russia. And I think there are very good reasons for that. We can talk about that. The second, and this is a more geostrategic shift, there has been, at least since the 1990s, a partnership between Russia and China that has been declared by both sides as a strategic partnership. This preceded President Yeltsin. That partnership, while it won't become an alliance, is going to certainly strengthen. And so that will be one other consequence of Ukraine. Now, in some sense, that's good for China. The question is, how good is it for Russia? So if you look back in history, the Russian-Chinese relationship has had ups and downs, from ideological solidarity to convergent interests to border disputes, including shooting along the border. And now it's in a very good phase. A Russian strategist might want to ask, well, do we want to be more dependent on China, given the troubled history, or do we want to be in a situation where we're kind of equidistant in the sense that we have a Western option as well as a Chinese option, so we have bargaining leverage against both? The war, for the moment at least, has pushed Russia much closer to China. And the war, while it has meant disruptions for China, means that the West is kind of tied up with a war on its Western flank. And I think that the Chinese probably are not unhappy that that's happening.
Great, if I may say. And the last question would be, how do you view the Indian position on Ukraine?
India has faced calls by the United States to condemn Russia. It has not done so. It has faced calls to scale back on Russian energy imports. In fact, it's increased imports at a discounted price. India has not joined the sanctions regime. And this must be understood against the backdrop of many decades of friendship between the Soviet Union, which was one of India's most reliable partners during the Cold War. Relationships with the United States were correct at certain times and verging on hostile at other times. The worst point perhaps being the 1971 India-Pakistan War, which gave rise to the birth of Bangladesh. And so I think that asking the Indians to take a step that transformed their relationship from Russia to good to bad was much too big a step. The other thing to bear in mind is that while the rest of the world has been asked to line up behind the sanctions regime and condemn the Russian invasion as a violation of norms, this is primarily a Europe-US concern. And while maybe it ought to be the concern of the rest of the world, it's far removed from the pressing concerns of countries like Brazil, India, and South Africa. So Prime Minister Modi's position is not, I think, for anyone who looks at the world through a realist perspective, in the least bit surprising.
Thank you so much, Professor Menon, for this interview. And just to summarize for our audience, we have discussed what are the basic motivations that have driven Europe and Russia to this war, what might be the consequences in terms of what's next for Europe, the international security and financial regime, India's interests, the fault lines across Europe, like the Sova Gap corridor, the European Union's integrity from NATO, and also the NATO strategic concept, and the sort of loopholes in that. So we will be presenting this interview and transcribed articles on our platforms soon, so please stay tuned for that. And Professor Menon, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rajan. It's my pleasure.